Hi, I'm Bri Allison with the National Library of Patient Rights and Advocacy, and welcome to our segment, Tell Us Your Story. Today we are joined by Ms. Sally Duplantier. Sally is a gerontologist with a mission to help older adults live a longer, healthier life. Her research and professional work will focus on increasing health span. She also is a founder of Zing, a holistic wellness program focused on enabling adults to take charge of their health. Zing provides education and coaching on lifestyle choices, including nutrition, movement, sleep, and stress. Furthermore, Sally partners with nonprofits to help improve health outcomes for underdeserved and underrepresented populations. Sally, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Bri, it's a delight to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for talking with us. So, to start off, can you talk about what a gerontologist is and a health span educator?
Sure, absolutely. A gerontologist is someone who studies aging across the lifespan. And as a gerontologist, we look at it from a physical perspective, biological, social, spiritual, emotional. So it's a very holistic look. Now, health span is a relatively new term. We used to talk a lot about longevity, which is how long you live, and that's increased dramatically. It's doubled since 1900. But we're living longer, but not necessarily better. So what health span looks at is the number of years in which you are free of chronic disease and disability. And so kind of I blend the two. My mission in starting Zing is to help people live their best life longer. And I do that primarily through education around lifestyle choices.
Perfect. That's very interesting. I never really heard the whole health span perspective before. And so you recently published a paper that looks at the health and well-being of family caregivers of Alzheimer's patients. How did you get interested in that research?
So to explain that, I'll tell you a little bit about my recent education. I say recent because in my mid-60s, I went back to school. I earned a certificate in nutrition science at Stanford, and then I went on to earn a master's of science degree in gerontology at USC. And while I was at USC, I did an internship at Stanford. And I worked with a professor of nutrition science, and we did a research project looking at the link between cognitive decline and diet. And we published that paper in a peer-reviewed journal article called Nutrients. And so in the process of doing that research, even though it was focused on diet and Alzheimer's and dementia, I became very intrigued by the stories of Alzheimer's patients and their families. And I started doing more research about chronic disease associated with the caregivers. And, the caregivers of dementia patients, the family caregivers, are far more likely to develop cardiovascular disease, diabetes, even Alzheimer's. They're at far greater risk of depression and even early mortality. So, given my mission around live your best life longer, I thought it would be really interesting to take a look at this population.
And we're very thankful that you do because these people and their health span are just as important as the people that started with dementia patients that they were taking care of. So, in your paper, you describe a series of interviews you did with family caregivers. Can you tell us a little bit about the people you interviewed and the purpose of your study?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that I was honored to talk to these people. So currently, education-wise, I'm at Indiana University, and I'm working on a graduate certificate in qualitative research. So this was a qualitative research study. And what's interesting when we look at these family caregivers is that there are a lot of data out there about them, but we don't know as much about their lived experiences. So that's what qualitative research is. Excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. Qualitative research really looks at, walking a mile in somebody else's shoes. The best we can replicate that. So this was a heterogeneous sample. I reached out to different organizations that work with caregivers. People could volunteer for the study. And I ended up with interviewing 8 people, pretty diverse. So the age range was from 32 to 83. They were from all over the United States. And they had different roles. So some were wives of husbands with dementia, some were daughters, and then I interviewed one husband.
Hmm. And what would you say were your top three findings? Or maybe break it down for us. What was your first top finding from
Yeah.
your research?
Yeah, so let me share with you like the main three questions that I asked, and then I can tell you about the findings. So
Perfect.
the interview was divided first into how do you define health and well-being? Because I thought it was really interesting to just get this from the perspective of the caregiver.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then what changed with respect to that. The second was around barriers to your own health and well-being. And the third was more around what would you need to do better self-care and make your health and well-being more of a priority. So the first finding related to this definition of health and well-being, and it was kind of surprising, it was really interesting to me, was that the priority for the people I interviewed was mostly around emotional and social well-being and some emphasis on spiritual. And the reason I say that is because people talked about health behaviors. I put quotes around it. So when I asked the question, most of them were like, oh, it's healthy eating and it's exercise and it's sleep, it's going to the doctor. But they didn't dwell there. I think in qualitative research, as a researcher, you just go on pause and you see where do people gravitate.
Mm-hmm.
And they might say like healthy eating and exercise, but then what they wanted to talk about was social engagement or the lack thereof, or it means being able to go out with your friends. And then they would tell me a story about how isolated they were. Heavy emphasis on emotional well-being and mental health. And not every person talked about spiritual well-being, but two of our older adults did, and it was an extremely important part. So, they mentioned some of the physical aspects. For example, we had women, older adult women, who were lifting their husbands, bathing their husbands, getting them out of bed. One woman described how she had to call the fire department to help get her husband out of bed during COVID because she
Oh,
couldn't get
wow.
anyone to come to her home. But what was interesting, Bri, was they didn't dwell there. They didn't really dwell on the physical aspects, and it was
Mm-hmm.
more the social and emotional aspects of health.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And so, can you talk more about a specific, or talk about your second finding, I guess?
Yeah, so the second finding, and this was fascinating to me, was around what are the barriers to health and well-being. And I summarized this into a main theme, and then I'll share with you the sub themes. So the theme that I called this was this mantle of responsibility that couldn't be shed.
Mm.
And it's not like my interviewees use that exact term, but in describing caregiving, um, it was like this cloak, this heavy cloak that couldn't be removed, even if they got some relief from caregiving duties. So, in some cases, there was no one else to rely on. That was clear in a few cases. In other cases, they had caregivers who came in and helped. They had a family member who helped. They even had a family member that their loved one could live with. But it didn't really matter
Mm.
because it was this cloak of responsibility and it couldn't easily be shed. And I think what was interesting, what I analyzed, was what were the reasons for that? And so the first finding we had was related to loss and grief. And those kind of go hand in hand because if you think of grief, it's a reaction to loss.
Mm-hmm.
And loss for these caregivers, it occurs on many levels. So, first of all, there's the loss of the loved one. They're physically present, but the person that they loved and knew, they're no longer there. And I see you responding to this because I know you had a loved one with dementia. Am I right with that? Yeah, yeah. So it's the loss of that person. It's also the loss of a relationship. So there's kind of an expectation in marriage. There's an expected reciprocity of a relationship, and that changes.
Mm-hmm.
And, for the daughters I interviewed, like they're the daughter and the other person's the mom, but this switches. So that relationship changes. And then the third one is really a loss of self. And, what I found in these stories that were shared with me was that the social life, the social engagement that this individual had, it became more and more narrow. And I don't want to say that people were complaining. They were not. They were sharing their stories. I heard things like it's an honor to be a caregiver. It's not a burden. But the realities and the stories reflected this loss and then grief. And with these caregivers, it became apparent that there's grief that's associated with when somebody dies. But
Mm-hmm.
this was different. This was what we called anticipatory grief, because you kind of know what's going to happen. You have a sense of it. And I see you nodding, so you know this firsthand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's extremely powerful. So you've got loss, you've got grief, then you've got resentment and guilt. And so there is an element of resentment because in many cases, your life is on hold. There's the guilt associated with resentment. But then what I found, Bri, was that there was guilt for anything, even people who had a caregiver who came in for 2 or 3 hours once a week. People felt guilty because they went out to lunch with a friend and didn't go grocery shopping. It's like, oh, I could have been more productive. We didn't have anything good for dinner. So these were powerful emotions. And then you look at social isolation and loneliness, and the lack of any kind of external interaction. One woman said, she said, I'm not in a cell, but I feel like a prisoner. She said to me, she said, when you reached out for the interview, I wanted to talk to you because, I thought, why not talk to, an adult in the middle of the day?
Mm-hmm.
So all of this, all of these complex emotions led to almost a lack of agency. So agency is our ability or our belief that we are in control of things. And the caregivers aren't in control. They really aren't, or they perceive themselves not to be. And so, what we found then was that just motivation to take care of oneself, to prioritize health and well-being, it just wasn't there. And again, then I kind of tie this back to that heavy burden of
Mm-hmm.
responsibility, that mantle that can't just be like, oh, okay, I'll just take that off.
Exactly. Those are all very powerful emotions. And even as you mentioned, my grandfather had dementia. Sorry. And my grandma was his sole caregiver. But my mom and my aunts and my uncles and all of my cousins and myself included, we would try and be over there as much as we could to help her out, but she experienced all of those emotions. And he progressively got worse during COVID just because of the lockdown and not being able to see pretty much any of us because we were so nervous of taking something over to them. That it just progressively got worse, and my grandma was just completely shut out from the rest of us too, and having to deal with the continuous questions and just taking care of him. And like you said, having she's about 4 feet tall and having to lift my grandfather and move him around and that kind of thing. And luckily she did have our family, and my uncles would help bathe him, and my mom and my aunt, they would all stay over during the nights to try and help her. And so it takes a village, and when people don't have those other surrounding people, I don't know how they do it. Like you said, you have that guilt that you feel from bringing somebody in to try and help you. Caregivers they got a really tough job.
They're heroes. They are
Yes,
heroes. Yes,
they
yes.
truly are. And sorry, let me get my tears here.
I
uh,
agree. I sobbed. during one of my interviews. I sobbed. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so to go into the next point, can you talk about your third finding a little bit
Yeah.
more?
Yeah. My third finding was fascinating, and I think it's very appropriate for the power of the patient. So my third finding was related to, what would help these caregivers take better care of themselves and prioritize their health and well-being. And it's this idea that what I wrote about was that it's not really incumbent on the caregivers, like they're doing everything they can. It's incumbent on the healthcare systems and medical professionals. And what I defined this as was that the healthcare system needs to look at caregivers as additional patients, not invisible patients.
Mm-hmm.
So something that came out in the literature review that I did, and I say, sometimes I say I, sometimes I say we, I co-authored this with my professor at Indiana U, was that we found the term invisible patients, which I thought was so appropriate. No one is looking at the caregiver, they're looking at the person with dementia. I was struck. I think I actually started crying a little bit in the interview I did with one woman when she said, Sally, in 5 years, nobody has ever asked me about me. She said, you're the first person to ask me, how are you doing? And what I found in the interviews was that at the time of diagnosis, which is complex, it's not like people go to the doctors once and then they get a diagnosis of dementia. It may take years to actually determine that it is dementia or Alzheimer's, another form of dementia. In the 8 interviews I did, only 2 were referred to support services.
Wow.
And those 2 people, they were referred to Alzheimer's groups, local Alzheimer's organization groups. They continued to do pretty well with support services. They had positive experiences, good stories. It was helpful. The other 6 said nobody ever mentioned anything about support service. They never sought out support services, which is consistent with literature. Most people don't. One woman I interviewed said, after dealing with, my mom and incontinence and meals and groceries and, cleaning her up and bathing, she said, the last thing I want to do is research more Alzheimer's. I mean, there's just not that capacity to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what I wrote about in this paper was this idea of, having healthcare systems look at the caregiver and the person with Alzheimer's. It's both. Alzheimer's is not a disease of individuals, it's a disease of families. And I think we need to rethink that from a healthcare and medical perspective.
Mm-hmm. Because it's essentially the caregiver is kind of losing themselves in this work that they are doing, like you mentioned.
They are. And we have a lot of data about the risks to their health. What's interesting is that by 2050, I think there's going to be we're projecting 139 million people worldwide with Alzheimer's.
Oh, wow.
An exponential increase. But you think of that then in light of the family caregivers and the burden on their health. I mean, this is a major public health crisis that I don't think we're recognizing enough. We're recognizing Alzheimer's, but we're not recognizing the health burden for the caregivers.
Exactly. And the invisible patient thing is it's just a strong perspective that we need to focus on. So can you give me a specific example of what you mean by an invisible patient from your research?
Yeah. So, the invisible patient is, I'll give you like a specific example. Someone I spoke with, she said, at the time of my mother's diagnosis, she said they told me, what type of, disease she had, that she was diagnosed specifically with Alzheimer's. They told me about her medications. They said, if you have any questions about her medications, call us and see us in 6 months. And that was it. And I am not blaming anyone. I mean, I hope it comes clear. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm just saying that the healthcare professionals have not been trained to think about this more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so your paper also talks about the need for a dementia case manager. So can you talk about more what that is and how that model is used in practice.
Yeah. So I'm going to point to a specific example because I think both UCLA and UCSF have good models for this. I'm a little more familiar with UCSF because I'm in Northern California. So they have a model called the care ecosystem. And it's a model, it's a toolkit, but what sets it apart is that it looks at the individual with the Alzheimer's and the caregiver. So both UCLA and UCSF are doing this. They look at them in tandem. It's a pair, it's a dyad. And what this is designed to do is treat and care for both. So this idea of the dementia case manager, I think UCSF calls it, they have a slightly different term for it, but it's this idea that Alzheimer's is a disease of stages. You know this going through, in your own family. And so it's not like, give me a brochure for support services and then I'll be fine. The disease progresses. My needs as a caregiver would change. Today it could be just, helping care for them, keeping them safe. But there are legal concerns. There's financial concerns. So having someone who helps the caregiver navigate those different stages of Alzheimer's disease is extremely important. And I was delighted in the research I did to see that we're starting to have healthcare institutions looking at this. But it's a fraction that are doing it right now.
And the dementia case manager, as well as the healthcare providers knowing more about dementia and the caregivers as a whole, it's important now, but like you said, as more dementia and Alzheimer's patients come around, it's going to become more pertinent that these people and we have these resources to help the families and the caregivers with the dementia patients.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's vital.
And so what would you say was your epiphany when it comes to improving the health and well-being of family caregivers of dementia patients?
Yeah. My takeaway was that it's not just the caregiver. It's not something the caregiver can do. I mean, bless their hearts, those who can try to prioritize their own health and well-being. But I think it's a bigger issue. It's a systemic issue, and it starts with healthcare providers and healthcare systems looking at the patient and the caregiver together.
Yes, we need to see some changes that focus on the caregiver as well for there to be any kind of real improvements. And so lastly, do you have any thoughts on additional research that you would like to do in this area?
Yeah. Bri, I'm fascinated by this research. I definitely want to continue. And I can give you a couple examples. So I think the first is looking at pragmatic clinical trials that kind of test this dyad model. And by pragmatic clinical trial, I mean just doing these clinical trials within, let's say, university health systems, that are accepting, all patients, all caregivers, and looking at if we treat people together, patient and caregiver, what's the outcome? And then I think from a research perspective, it's not just data. It's not just changes in a depression scale, which is fascinating and interesting, but it's the kind of research that I'm doing. It's the qualitative piece to really listen to and understand their stories, because it adds a depth to our understanding that you don't get just from data. So that's the first one, more pragmatic clinical trials that look at this, dyad model. The second one is an area that I'm already involved in, and it's increasing diversity in clinical trials of Alzheimer's patients. So people of color, Blacks and Hispanics, are far more likely to get Alzheimer's than their white counterparts, and yet they're dramatically underrepresented in clinical trials. There's just such a disparity. And so I'm part of a team now that has received funding from the American Heart Association, and we're looking at creative ways to incentivize, novel ways to incentivize diverse populations to participate in Alzheimer's clinical trials. So that's a huge need.
Well, both of those focuses sound very important and exciting, and we can't wait to see where your work takes you.
Thank you.
And that concludes our interview for today. Again, Sally, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story. Your work in raising awareness and advocating for patients and caregivers has been instrumental in creating change and ensuring that their voices are heard. Please make sure to check out Sally's website at myzinglife.com for more information, as well as speaking events, programs, and her blog that helps patients and caregivers to better navigate the challenges that come with dementia. And if you're interested in setting up an interview with us, please email me at powerofpatient@gmail.com with your name and email address. I'm Bri Allison for the National Library of Patient Rights and Advocacy, and thank you so much for watching.